What's up, everybody? This is Willie, and today, the recent season of Survivor 49 has concluded, so likewise, I'll be making my full-on review on this season, and I'm going to be doing a different sort of formula than the traditional episode-by-episode review, since, quite frankly, for this quality of the season, I was basically checked out of a lot, so it feels like I'm going to review it in a more broader scope, where I just sum up as much as I can each phase of the game, and then by the end of it, share my thoughts on it, on what I liked and didn't like, do the typical rating of who I think is the best and worst player of the season, as well as reflecting on my preseason video. So that's what I'm gonna do, and with all that said, let's get into it. So we have the season begin with, likewise as New Era fashion, 3 tribes of 6. Like, that ain't getting old, but this first stretch of the game was very rough, with one particular tribe in Kelly just becoming a part of the category of a disastrous tribe, with their consistent challenge losses and dwindling numbers, with members like Nicole, Annie, and Jeremiah falling fate to it. On top of it, Jake, supposedly the strongest player and team member on the tribe, just gets medevac from the game, all because of a sea crate, which has been deemed to be a very venomous snake, but he was lucky enough that it was a dry bite. But all in all, the whole sequence with his lead up to his medevac was so dramatic that Survivor finally gave us a lot more behind the scenes visual because of everything that's going down with Jake. But overall, with the tribe now diminishing down to 2 members in Sophie B and Alex, and by like the final 14, this is just further cementing why 3 tribes must be let go at this point. Because not only is it rough to see a tribe continuously lost over and over again, it's also a huge downgrade in quality from a TV standpoint, as we're just not getting much dynamic gameplay with the smaller numbers and the repetitive nature. And it also fundamentally takes away a lot of the dynamics with the other tribes, where we're not seeing how their respective games be brought to the test, since they're just continuously winning out, which, I mean, to be fair, is part of the whole standard of Survivor, where you have to avoid tribal council. But from a more televised standpoint, we don't get much complexity from them, and especially from the Hina tribe, where the NFL is so lopsided once again, where it's clear that we're not supposed to be caring for Hina and instead caring for Kelly and Uli, with the latter tribe getting a lot more focus on players like Shannon, Savannah, and Rizzo, which the last 2 names I talked about are going to have some huge prominence as we go along in the season. And not just that, but for some later circumstances as well. And now with that said, we get to another phase of the game where it's a tribe squad, which, no crap, we're not about to have a oolong situation with Kelly's. And with 14 players left, it finally pertains to a 2-tribe format that us superfans really have missed since Winners at Wars, so the feeling of just seeing 2 tribes is an absolute refresher for us. However, it comes with the downside that it just ends up with a division that has such predictable boots from each of them, where this all commences the Hina versus Uli war, with the 2 tribes just gunning for each other's numbers that are in the minority. And we see what happens with the new Hina tribes, where the 2 original Hinas, Matt and Jason, fall victim to an essential pagonging because of tribal lines. And the situation would have happened similarly on the new Uli tribe with someone like Shannon if her tribe ended up going to tribal, but she was very lucky on that front. However, what she wasn't lucky is that her fellow Uli and Sage had started turning on against her and initiating this one-sided rivalry with her, which was just intense. But yeah, everything felt like it was going to be good on paper, but it just ended up shaping up to be a continuous slog of gameplays through tribal lines and such foreseeable outcomes from each tribe division. So then we get to a second swap, because I'm certain production didn't like the idea of 2 tribes during its phase, and guess what? Another swap happened with 3 tribes again, but it's 3 tribes of 4, which, what are we doing at this point? But anyway, let's just put Karen to the swap tribe that ended up culminating with the Shannon boot thanks to Sage with the help of Jawan and Steven. So that finally ended off that one-sided rivalry and gave us a pretty remarkable exit that involves Sage refusing to hug Shannon, the player who got eliminated, in contrast to the usual eliminated player refusing to hug somebody, so that's something noteworthy. But then we get to the merge, which this is where the season becomes a hot potato of good rounds and slow rounds, where thankfully we started with a very strong round, with Savannah, Rizzo, and Nate finally facing some adversity, with Juwan and Sage teaming up with the Hinas to blindside one of them in Nate as a safe vote to counteract a public idol that Rizzo possesses that he could have played on himself or Savannah. And furthermore, Sophie is a part of that grouping, which does lead to our landmark trio of the season, Rizzo, Savannah, and Sophie B. And also to mention the elephant in the room, there were 2 Sophies on this season, with Sophie S from the Yellow Tribe and Sophie B. But in Jeff's way of trying to differentiate one of them, he decides to have Sophie B go by Soph, which, no, I am not referring to her like that, and I'm sticking with Sophie B because I think that's what she was always meant to be. But anywho, after that Nate blindside, the trio are like at the bottom. However, Rizzo still has his idol, and 2, Sophie B had recently found a secret knowledge is power advantage. So then this trio is able to pick up numbers on their side with someone like Sophie S, especially in a round where she was going to go home through the infamous Matt Blankenship twist, but Rizzo and Savannah were able to work on obtaining her as another number and flipping on MC, which then leads to the following round where they're able to maintain their grounds and find more numbers on their side, with successfully flipping back Sage and Jawan to help spearhead a blindside on Alex, who was attempting to play the middle between the Hina and Ulis, but was ultimately caught with that gameplay. But then the next time Jawan and Sage choose to flip back, but with Sophie still choosing to stay loyal to the trio, it does lead to her ultimately exposing Jawan and Sage's flip-flopping to the trio, which led to them uniting to blindside Jawan, with Savannah in particular giving some great performance with her reactions to, I guess, fuel Jawan's demeanor on his believed success in blindsiding her, only for it to backfire and him to be on the other end of the blindside, which, like Rizzo would say, this is absolute cinema. But then we get to a slower round with Sophie as eventually getting her downfall, with the trio even turning on her, I guess in comeuppance to her trying to flip on them, specifically Savannah. But hey, also on top of that, Steven, who was the consensus target, had earned a block of vote advantage, as well as winning a clutch immunity. So Sophie fairly got unlucky with a lot of those circumstances, or else it would have been Steven going home that round. But talking about that, we go to the next round with Sophie now getting with talks about potentially turning on Rizzo and Savannah, and she does have that chance to do so. However, she fairly misses out on that opportunity once Savannah wins immunity, and with Rizzo still possessing his idol, now her plan is essentially in ruins, and furthermore, the other side now want to target her as a safe vote. However, Rizzo and Savannah do some convincing to get them to turn on each other, specifically on Steven, as he's the prospective jury threat, and while he does make his attempt to block one of the trio's votes to ensure that his side will have the numbers in a 3-2 situation, his threat level was too much, and while Sophie B does try to steal his advantage, the problem is it's played before the tribal council begins, so that advantage all goes to waste. But luckily, it did not end up being tragic to her, and by the end of it, Steven finally gets blindsided with his side of Christina and Sage choosing to flip on him as well, which for Christina's sake, it feels like it didn't really make sense and ended up being essentially game over for her too. And then the final round of voting, with Savannah winning her literal 4th immunity and Rizzo still having his public idol that he will automatically play for himself on the final round is available. So Sophie B has no chance to flip on her allies, and instead now Sage and Christina are in a position to target each other, which for Sophie B and Rizzo is the rightful move to keep around Christina, as she's a better fire maker but also someone who's beatable in challenges. And especially if you want to take out Savannah, who has displayed such clear dominance, utilizing Christina to be the one to knock out Savannah in a fire making was the most ideal in the spot. However, Savannah had her own agenda in keeping Sage and targeting Christina, which she does have a debate with her allies on this, and despite that not being in their best interest, they eventually choose to let down their sword and let Savannah have her way with Christina going, which would end up being a game-ending move for Rizzo and Sophie B. And we see that play dividends to the following round, where to start off, we have Sophie B finally winning out an important immunity that guaranteed her spot in the final tribal, and with her now finally taking that shot at Rizzo and Savannah by putting the two of them in fire, which, yeah, that's what you should be doing. It does finally lead to the ultimate battle that ends with Savannah winning out in the fire making challenge and sealing the end to Rizzo's game, which, tracing back to how it pays dividends for his bad move to send out Christina, yeah, this is what it pertained to. So that move ended up being severely costly. But hey, with now us losing Rizzo, we get an all-female final 3 with Sage, Sophie B, and Savannah. Literally 20 seasons later, after San Juan del Sur being the last season to accomplish that, on top of a fun coincidence that both of their finales took place on December 17th. But anyways, they make their cases at the final tribal council, and it does get quite interesting by the end stretch of it, with some very feisty questions that did lead to a lot of arguments within the finalists. But either way, we get to the final result with the majority of the jury casting their votes for Savannah to be rewarded the title of sole survivor this season, with Sophie B getting 2 votes, which nice, and Sage ends up getting a sympathy vote from her boy Jawan. But yeah, that pretty much sums up everything about Survivor 49 for you. So yeah, that is what I think about Survivor 49. What are my takeaways on the season? Well, like I mentioned at the beginning, with me being checked out of the season, it speaks for itself that the season didn't really feed much into me. Like, I don't personally find myself connecting much with this season, and to be honest, I think I can see in the world where I think the 50 factor on them all comes into play because of the higher profile it comprehends that lessens our interest into this season. And on top of that, obviously with the spoiled players being Savannah and Rizzo appearing on that season, it does fundamentally take away from the whole tension with this season, as we already know who are going to be returning. On top of that, the edit didn't really do much grace either to really build that tension, as it once again was so lopsided that it basically told us that, hey, you guys should never care about Hina because they would end up getting decimated by the end of it. Like, I don't think this season holds to much high regard, probably in a more middling stretch, as I feel like the back third at least picked up at a point, and even in the finale, I was pretty shell-shocked with a lot of things that took place. So at least I'll give props props to that. And overall, what I like about this season, at least, is that we had a solid grouping of game players this season where, yes, I mean, there are a couple who are just not that great, but I did like how we got a good grouping of players who are actually decent game players. But obviously, the downside of that is that their gameplay just doesn't really translate much to charm or anything. Plus, also, the pre-merge was definitely at its lowest, where there wasn't really truly a big sort of game move until the Shannon boot, which that's 6 episodes in, and that is telling that with the lackluster quality of the pre-merge that significantly harms this season's pacing. The merge onwards was fine enough, but I mean, we do get rounds like the Alex and Sophie vote-offs, which I feel like was just shown in a very tame way, especially how much the show tries to endorse on blind sides. Like, I think they could have tried and put a lot more to make it more interesting. So yeah, those are a lot of things that I like and didn't like from this season, and now let's get right into the ratings. So to talk about who the best player is, I mean, to be honest, this season had a really strong game-bodied cast that made the gameplay so dynamic, and I did have some reservations with my pick, but after seeing their game, I'm selecting Sophie B because honestly, outside of her knowledge as power faux pas, she was very well situated in the game and did not rely on any sort of advantage or such sort to maintain her safety throughout the game, and she does eventually take her shot at her allies despite it being so late at that point. It still showed how instinctive she is, which compared to the rest of the players, I mean really her allies and her fellow finalists, I wouldn't put too much to them in high regards because they were either not as influential or they were just relying on some sort of immunity that fundamentally aborted all of their social plays. So with that, I'm rating Sophie B as the best player of the season. And then for the worst player, I was quivering between the bottom 2 players, but at this point I decided to just pick Nicole. Even though in the grand scheme of Survivor, I feel like Annie would be a much more worse player. However, the saving grace for her is that she survived the tribal over Nicole, who, while didn't actively get herself out, was still not someone who was positioned well on the tribe either. And for someone like Annie, who is by far more actively bad, somehow being able to scrape by a round over her is already indicative that Nicole's plays were not that great either. So with all this said, while not as bad of a first boot, I still have to land Nicole here as the worst player of the season. And then lastly, to reflect on my preseason video, boy did I have a lot of wrong reads, especially with thinking that the first 2 boots were actually going to be endgamers. Definitely shows right there, I am never good with predictions. But either way, looking back at me picking Sophie B as my winner pick, I was actually pretty close. She literally got 2nd place this season, so I was just 1 placement off. Now, to be fair, I am personally happy Savannah won because she's the kind of players that I would always root for. And technically, I should have picked her considering she and Rizzo would be appearing in Survivor 50. However, I just felt like there was some sort of reservations that made me feel more confident in Sophie B than her, so that's why I ended up selecting her. So I was very close. But either way, my other predictions weren't as accurate as I thought it would be, so yeah, not really the best assessment in the world, but it is what it is. No need for me to sulk about it. And that wraps up my coverage for Survivor 49. Yeah, a season that lacks any sort of charm that has me attached to it. However, I do really appreciate some of its moments that it was still able to elicit, but overall, the season is just such a low middling energy that I just didn't see myself really caring for much of it, not having any sort of resonance whatsoever. But that's that, and subscribe for more, as now we're about to get to Survivor 50, and I'll be covering that on this channel, which is definitely going to be hopefully a landmark season. So with that, I appreciate you guys tuning in.